He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora, ko William Ray tēnei. Welcome to Black Sheep. Before we begin, this episode's focused on a particularly terrible period of anti-Chinese racism in New Zealand. As a result, this episode's going to include some really nasty language which was directed at Chinese New Zealanders at the time. It also includes discussion of sexual assault. So please listen with care. This episode probably isn't appropriate for younger listeners. Imagine you've travelled back in time to the early 1900s. It's the first week of August, 1908, and you've taken the train into town to grab some bits and pieces for dinner. Supermarkets haven't been invented yet, so you've been to the greengrocer for some carrots and celery, the butcher for mutton chops, the dairy for butter and cheese. As you make your way back to the train station, you pass a newsstand. And for some reason, it catches your eye. You pick up a copy of that new weekly newspaper everyone's been reading lately. It's only been up and running for about 3 years, but it's by far the most popular paper in the country. You board the train, you take a seat, and start reading. You skim the front page story. It's something boring about the American election, the trade policy of Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan. Page 2 and 3 are all sports fixtures: horse racing, football, boxing. Page 4 is dominated by an angry column arguing against the prohibition of alcohol. You notice the rest of the page is mostly filled with ads for hotels and whiskey cellars. Maybe there's a bit of a connection there. Then you turn to page 5, and a huge headline in bold block capital letters jumps out at you.
George Howe, the beastly brothel-keeper. Horrible revelations in the magistrate's court.
Above this is the main headline.
Concupiscent Chinaman, where white women consorted with chows.
Concupiscent is an old-fashioned word. It's actually so old-fashioned I had to look it up. It means horny, or, lustful. Chow, as you've probably already guessed, was a derogatory term for Chinese people. Maybe you're intrigued by this headline. Maybe you're just so horrified you can't tear your eyes away. Either way, you keep reading. And maybe just brace yourself here.
It was January of last year that Truth electrified the whole of New Zealand by publishing a full report of the magistrate's court proceedings, wherein 2 dirty, foul, filthy and fornicating Chinamen named Yao Li and Ah Chow were charged with carnally knowing 2 white girls who were under the age of consent. If there was any indecent and obscene matter in that report, this paper took the risk because, in pursuance with its anti-Chinese policy, it wished to emphasise the great danger that these yellow hybrids are, not only to the white man's welfare, but also to the purity of our white girls and women, thus fouling our very national existence.
As you make your way further down the page, you learn how this man named in the headline, George Howe, has pled guilty to running a brothel, and how this case linked back to another prosecution almost 2 years earlier. Back in December of 1906, the police had raided George Howe's fruit shop in Wellington and found 4 young women hiding in various rooms. 2 were in their early 20s. The other 2 were just 15 years old. In January of 1907, 2 men, Yao Li and Ah Chow, were each sentenced to a year in prison for unlawful carnal knowledge of these 2 teenagers. In other words, sexual assault of a person under the age of consent. It's clearly a serious case, but even so, the language used in this article is eye-watering. You've already read how it referred to the Chinese men involved. But the victims, these two 15-year-olds, they don't get off any easier. Without missing a beat, this article flips from talking about the purity of our white girls to describing this pair of teenagers as
a dirty pair of trollops.
The younger of the two is labelled
an impudent little wretch without shame or decency.
The paper says they
practically pandered to the lustful passions of the chows and were having a royal time of it generally.
So, what on earth is going on here? That's certainly the question I found myself left with after reading this, frankly, horrific article. It was only the latest in a slew of similar stories this paper had been publishing, claiming, without any evidence, that this sort of crime was widespread. I've put links to some of these articles on our website if you really want to read them. Personally, I wouldn't recommend it. They all come from the single most influential newspaper ever to be published in New Zealand. The New Zealand Truth.
Truth starts 3 years before these attacks on George Howe, but it was already at that time in 1908 boasting the largest circulation in the country. I mean, what we've got here is a populist, sensationalist, muckraking weekly filled with sex and crime.
This is Redma Iska. He's a Wellington-based historian and author of Truth, The Rise and Fall of the People's Paper. Redma actually used to work for Truth as a young reporter back in the 1980s.
Truth is the branch office of an Australian paper, a so-called People's Paper, which was consciously aimed at working people. And these were very skillfully put together, very brightly written and easily digestible papers that had been hugely successful in the States. You've got, Pulitzer, Scripps and William Randolph Hearst, selling millions and millions of copies of these papers, especially in the big cities.
There's a name for these kind of newspapers. In America, they were referred to as yellow journalism, but in the UK and in New Zealand, they became better known as tabloids. Gen Z listeners might not be familiar with the tabloids, but you youngsters, go and ask a baby boomer or a Gen Xer, maybe an older millennial, they will know all about the tabloids, and especially the New Zealand Truth.
By mid-century, Truth claimed a readership of 1 million at a time when the population was only 2.5 million, And
wow.
Yeah, man. And it was the closest thing to a national newspaper New Zealand ever had. And I mean, it could be, and it was, contradictory and inconsistent. 1 minute an outlet for editorial hate crimes like these ones. Next minute, a proponent of social justice and champion of the downtrodden. Just it pleased itself. It would every week it would have a new angle. And I think we can really see it in its heyday, the 1920s to the 1970s, orchestrating and shaping public opinion in an extraordinary way that we forget about.
So today on Black Sheep, we're telling the story of George Howe and the crimes he committed. But we're also telling a story of an editorial hate crime, as Redma Iska so colourfully described it. Well, shall we crack into it?
Yeah.
So actually, why don't we start by painting a bit of a picture? So this is Scott Bainbridge. He's a crime writer. We talked to him for a previous episode of Black Sheep about the Bassett Road machine gun murders. Scott is actually the guy who first alerted me to the George Howe story. It came up while we were discussing another podcast which Scott's working on for RNZ. And I can't talk about that podcast right now, but I think Black Sheep listeners will find it very interesting. So we'll definitely be sticking some stuff about that in this feed in the near future. What I can say is that Scott's podcast starts in the same place as the story of George Howe. Early 20th century Wellington.
Wellington back then, or the TRO flats, was like a seething mess of back alleys and, dirty streets. With the urban migration to places like Wellington, a lot of the poor gravitated to Te Aro Flats because that was the cheapest area of housing.
Te Aro Flats is now the central business district of Wellington. It stretches from the harbour in the north towards Aro Valley on one edge and Mount Victoria on the other. George Howe's fruit shop was at 59 Adelaide Road, right at the southwestern corner of the flats near the Basin Reserve. This whole area used to be a coastal swamp where local Māori harvested flax, eels and other kai. But in 1855, a massive earthquake lifted the land around Wellington about an extra 1.5 metres above sea level. The swamp drained away and colonists started building homes and businesses on the newly exposed flat land which surrounded an old Ngāti Mutunga pā called Te Aro, hence the name Te Aro Flats. But as Scott Bainbridge explains, by the early 1900s, this wasn't the best part of town.
It was a slum area, and there was so much overcrowding. All manners of vice. A lot of the hotels were there. The seamen from the ships would sign off, and they'd head straight for the hotels and spend all their pay getting drunk.
A bit of drunken crime and vice was sort of the natural price to pay for being the most prosperous city of early 20th century New Zealand. Redma Isker has actually written about this period in another of his books, a biography of Wellington City.
It's booming here. Everything is here. All the head offices are here. We're the finance centre. We're so absolutely bullish. It's all happening here in Wellington. It's like Auckland is today. I found this great quote that I once used that someone was so confident. They said it wouldn't, if the seat of government moved elsewhere, it wouldn't make any difference at all. And that's always haunted me, that, because you think of that today, Yeah. The level of confidence here is extraordinary. The population is absolutely booming here.
And part of that booming population was New Zealand's Chinese community.
You might remember this as a bit of a red light district, but there were also significant Chinese businesses around this area.
This is Lynette Shum. She's a Wellington Chinese historian.
For instance, Harry Wong's shop was there selling imported Chinese foods and other sorts of things, and they also exported deer tails back to China. There used to be another business down there that was also a Chinese grocery shop.
Each year, Lynette organises historical tours around Haining and Frederick Streets in central Wellington. Back in the early 20th century, those streets were the bustling heart of Wellington's Chinatown.
Yeah, the whole city is really, really changed from those Chinatown days. But see, if you can imagine, these huge buildings with big footprints used to be lots of Chinese shops like greengrocers, butchers, bread shops, bakers, haberdasherers. I love that word.
What is that? Hat makers, eh? Haberdashers?
No, that's like fabric and pins and needles and zips and things like that. So
sort of the equivalent of Spotlight today.
Yeah, but imagine on a teeny basis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, even for Wellington, the wind was especially blustery during this tour. So Lynette and I ducked inside the Wellington Trades Hall for shelter so she could tell me more about the story of the capital's Chinese community. And as Lynette says, it's a story which starts with the Otago gold rush in the 1860s and 70s.
The people who were working, getting gold here, once the easy gold died out, they started to drift away, and the Otago Chamber of Commerce was really worried about the downturn in economic activity. Chinese working in the goldfields of Victoria came to have a reputation of going over ground that was already gone over and making it profitable. So the first group were actually invited by the Otago Chamber of Commerce. So they came over, and then word got out, and other Chinese, they brought their family, but also other Chinese came.
If you want to know more about New Zealand's gold rush, well, there's an excellent podcast about it in a series called the Aotearoa History Show, hosted by yours truly alongside Marnie Dunlop.
But gradually, the gold did die down, and so the next centre after that, Wellington, became more popular. Oh, this is a photo, which is not good for radio.
Great for podcast, yeah.
Yeah. That's my grandfather's uncle there.
Wow.
So he came over in 1874 looking for gold.
He's looking very Wild West in that photo. They've got all
He's the only... Oh, no, there's another guy without a hat. This was taken... The reason
What I'm looking at is a group of Chinese men dressed all in waistcoats and big hats, except for Lynette's great-granduncle and one other guy. Lynette also showed me a photo of the house where one of her great-grandfathers lived once they moved to Wellington. It's a single-storey cottage on Haining Street. The price is marked in the picture, just £5.
Central Wellington.
To buy.
Actually, it's misleading because it's just the house itself. It's not the land underneath.
Right, yeah.
And I know my family's quite high class because they lived in a £30 house as opposed to a £4 house. So that's where my grandfather had his business and raised 6 children.
Wow. In a little place like that.
In a little place like that. They weren't the posh houses like in Mount Victoria or Thorndon here. These were very small, humble workers' cottages and light industrial buildings. So it wasn't as salubrious as the other places, and very quickly lost any sheen that it did have. It became run down and bedraggled, and that's when the immigrants could go in. It was cheap, because it was very humble. It was close to the city where they worked. You can see people come off the port, hop off the boat, pay their poll tax here and just wander up here. So it's really a good position for immigrants to settle in. And it's part of a phenomenon that's around the world where immigrants come into the fringe of the city.
One of those immigrants living on the fringe of Wellington was our black sheep, George Howe. He didn't start off as George. His original name was Sun Hao Lee. But as Scott Bainbridge says, he changed his name after arriving in New Zealand. A lot of Chinese migrants did that back then, and of course many still do.
He anglicised his name to George Howe. He'd come over to New Zealand in 1892, and he established a fruit shop in Adelaide Road. Although he had a hand in some of the businesses in Haining Street, I don't know to what degree.
George Howe seems to have had relatively good English, and this landed him a job with a pair of successful Australian-born property tycoons.
George and his other mate, Chin Ah Leong, they were rent collectors for the Duan brothers, and the Duan brothers were legitimate property owners in Wellington at that time. They owned quite a few hotels and quite a lot of the buildings and in the Chinatown area as well. And so George and Mr. Ah Leong were handpicked, I guess, by the Duan brothers because their level of English was so good. They could rely on them for being translators, to collect the rent from the Chinese tenants.
But it wasn't long before George Howe came to the attention of the police for opium dealing, brothel keeping, and gambling.
He'd been arrested reasonably early for running Fantan. Fantan was regarded as a type of gambling.
In the minds of many Pākehā, this wasn't anything unusual. Wellington's Chinatown was assumed to be jam-packed with illegal brothels plus gambling and opium dens. And this wasn't totally wrong, but it's also not the full story.
The biggest draw for non-Chinese to the area was this game called Pakapu. You can see it looks a bit similar to a lotto ticket. In fact, I've heard that Alan Hyatt, the minister who introduced lotto to New Zealand, played Pakapu when he was a young man.
We've got a picture of one of these Pakapu tickets on our website, and like Lynette says, it looks just like a lotto ticket. But instead of a grid of numbers, it's a grid of 80 Chinese characters, each representing a different word.
The words are actually the first 80 words of a 1,000-year-old Chinese prose poem. The tricky thing about this poem, in the 1,000 words, no single word was ever repeated.
Really?
The emperor gave one of his men this challenge. By tomorrow night, I want you to have done a poem. I want it to 1,000 words and no 2 words are to be repeated. If you don't do it, you are going to die.
Because no words in the poem are repeated, in Pakapu, the characters representing the words act like numbers in lotto. You pick your characters, and if they match the ones that get drawn, you win a payout. But here's the thing. This form of gambling was against the law.
It was illegal from 1881 to maybe 1972, I think, because it was a Chinese game of chance. You could play poker, you could play two-up, you could play whist, you could play any game you liked and gambled as much as you liked. The moment it was Chinese, it was illegal. Yet it was still really, really popular.
I mean, was there no justification other than it was being run by Chinese people that it was illegal?
Yeah. And then eventually the government realised, hang on, gambling is very popular. We'll get over our high horses and we'll actually get money from it. And so they started running it themselves.
So do you think the lotto is really just a continuation of Pakapu? In a slightly different form,
it's very, very similar.
Back in George Howe's time, police regularly raided Chinese homes and businesses on suspicion of gambling. The other big target for raids were Chinese properties suspected of selling opium. George Howe seems to have been in on that business too, alongside his mate, Chin Ao Leong.
He ran an opium den at 29 Haining Street, and he and George was in the background, but he was sick of getting regularly raided by the police, and so he fit a steel door with an iron bolt to the premises and put 3 fences around the outside of his property. So when the police came into raid and the police found that they couldn't get through, or they were struggling to get through, it allowed a lot of the punters to just sort of escape out of the back window, and for them to be able to get rid of a lot of the paraphernalia, although the smell there was pretty obvious.
George Howe seems to have considered these police raids more of a nuisance than a real problem. And as Lynette Shum explains, the police had a similar attitude towards George and others like him.
The police that I interviewed for this thought both the gambling and the opium were victimless crimes. The gambling was well run and looked clean and honest, and the opium, they would arrest people, but then they would give them opium in the cells to prevent withdrawal symptoms and then just release them after they paid a fine, because they didn't cause any trouble, and they were, unlike the drunks they had to deal with, they didn't mind dealing with the opium addicts.
Similarly, the police didn't pay much attention to people who sold opium.
They saw them basically as victimless crimes because it was basically the Chinese that it was harming. They'd get worried if they saw that it might be affecting Pākehā clients, and so they might act firmly then. But because it was kept largely within Chinese society, then they weren't too tough on it.
Lynette says this was actually a frustration for some in the Chinese community who'd been the ones to petition the government to outlaw the sale of opium in the first place. But as Lynette says, even after it was outlawed, it wasn't treated as a serious crime. That's partly because police in this era just didn't care about the welfare of Chinese addicts, and partly because police in this era had major issues with corruption. But it was also partly because Te Aro Flats had plenty of other problems to keep them occupied.
It was notorious. It was regarded as the Wild West of New Zealand. It was the only part of New Zealand that required 2 police stations within a very short vicinity of each other, because there was trouble 24/7.
Te Aro Flats was plagued by a combination of alcohol-fuelled violence, mugging, petty theft and low-key gang warfare. In fact, there was so much trouble that most new recruits didn't even last a year policing the flats.
The attrition rate, I believe, was about 3 months before the police got sick of, the never-ending arrests and also violence upon themselves. I wouldn't say there were razor gangs like there was in Sydney and Melbourne, but the gangs there were pretty rough, and a lot of the gangs that were bad enough to be in Australia that were kicked out, they came over to New Zealand.
So while George Howe got busted for gambling and opium, he probably wasn't public enemy number one in the minds of the police.
There is evidence that he was involved with procuring girls in Haining Street for the purposes of prostitution, but he really, his role in the early stages was just to take the money.
George Howe mostly existed under the radar. He was known to local police, he got raided from time to time and spent a bit of time in jail, including doing a few months for brothel-keeping. But in the Wild West of early 20th century Wellington, he was nothing special. That is, until January 1907, when the New Zealand Truth got wind of a particularly salacious court case.
At the Supreme Court yesterday, before Dr. MacArthur, 2 Chinamen named Yao Li and Ah Chow were charged with having had carnal knowledge of 2 females named Lucy Elizabeth Sinclair and Gladys Florence Jones.
Lucy and Gladys were both 15 years old. The legal age for consent was 16. The teenagers had been scooped up by the police in a raid of George Howe's fruit shop on Adelaide Road in December of 1906. This raid also caught another couple of girls who were a few years older. When they were interviewed by the police, the girls said they went to George Howe's shop because they'd heard it was a good place to make easy money selling sex.
These are girls who had left school at an early age to support their family and were getting the minimum wage, or they were girls from the local orphanage or the industrial school for girls, which was kind of like a bit of a borstal. If they wanted money, they knew where to go. George would entice them and he would, use them as prostitutes. He had 3 bedrooms upstairs in his fruit shop that he would rent out to the girls. These men would pay George 7 shillings. The girls were obliged to give him 2 shillings when they could keep the 5, and that was quite a bit of money for girls that were aged between 15 and 20 because they were quite young. But these girls knew what they were getting into. I think a lot of people knew what was actually going on, and certainly one of the constables on a particular day, he was out waiting, and he was seeing these girls come out with, putting money in their pockets, and he put the pressure on the girls, and they turned on George, and that's how he got arrested.
George Howe was rounded up, and so were 2 of his clients, Yao Li and Ah Chow. Those 2 were the first to face trial in January 1907. According to Truth's coverage of the case, both pled guilty, but initially insisted they hadn't done anything wrong. Here's how Truth reported the testimony of the arresting officer.
Acting Detective Williams informed them that he had warrants for the arrest on the present charge. Yao Li replied, "No, you humbug, only twice been here, paid them 5 shillings each." Williams replied, "They're too young, you ought to know that." Yao Li replied, No, plenty smaller come here, no humbug." Both Chinamen spoke English well and were fairly intelligent. From their answers to him, he concluded that neither of the accused thought they were doing wrong.
Now, if this prosecution happened today, it seems pretty unlikely this kind of testimony would win much sympathy. But in a somewhat astonishing twist, Yao Li and Ah Chow both got off fairly lightly. They were each only sentenced to a year in prison. The maximum possible sentence was 5 years. As the Press Association noted,
His Honour took into consideration the fact that the girl had been previously corrupted and the jury's recommendation of Ah Chow to mercy on the grounds of solicitation by the girl.
and I guess that just goes to show that early 20th century stigma against sex workers was just as powerful as the stigma against Chinese people. If these girls ever got any sympathy, it wasn't thanks to the New Zealand Truth. One of the headlines of its January 1907 article read,
"Silly, salacious sluts snared by the slimy slit eyes."
props for alliteration, but the racism is pretty shocking. Even more astonishing was how the Truth talked about the victims in this case. But Redma Iska wasn't surprised.
Truth will have a bob each way, mate. I mean, it'll just please itself. It's the most contradictory and shockingly flexible kind of journalism, and it'll go both ways. And that, I think, made some people so angry about it, because it would be so shameless in the way that it would move around these different angles of things,
The Truth did get taken to task for its demonisation of the Chinese community from time to time. Like in December 1907, an editorial in Wellington's Evening Post criticised Truth for praising the man who murdered Joe Kum Yung, a retired gold miner who'd been shot dead on Frederick Street in 1905. The killer, Lionel Terry, turned himself into the police, claiming he'd killed the elderly man to draw attention to the dangers of Chinese migration. We've talked a bit more about this case in our episode that we did on the history of eugenics in New Zealand. In the 1900s, Truth all but said in multiple articles that the murder of this innocent Chinese man was justified. One literally ended with the phrase, "God bless Lionel Terry." And when it copped flack from the Evening Post in 1907, Truth published this in response.
The penny-pinching, pious Post would have everyone believe that recent outrages on Chinamen were due to the canonization of Lionel Terry, forgetting all the while that the white, young or old, has a natural antipathy to anything yellow. The small boy, the youth, and the man will always look at the Chow as his natural enemy, and it is foolish on the Post part to think or print otherwise.
And as Redma Iska points out, sadly, a lot of people would have agreed with the Truth there.
Even though it's uncomfortable for us to acknowledge this today, I think these attacks and this approach that Truth was taking, these were pretty common, pretty mainstream views. Truth, I think, just pushed the envelope and, went a lot further. Truth arrives in 1905 in a country ruled by an openly racist leader. Good old Richard Seddon, his great iron statue still dominates the forecourt at Parliament, his arms outstretched, he's our great political colossus, workers' champion, for men and women, coining the phrase, God's own country. But he founded his career on attacking the Chinese, spearheading a punishing entry tax to exclude them, the notorious poll tax. And, Truth's founder really loved Seddon and praised him for arousing, I've just got a quote here, for arousing the apathetic white conscience of the empire. And Truth called him the biggest man in Australasia.
Redma says anti-Chinese rhetoric was especially popular among the Truth's working class readers.
A lot of this was actually economic. Chinese migrants were seen essentially as, union busters. They were sort of basically individual workers who were really prepared to work for a lot less than others.
So what's going on here is that Pākehā-owned businesses were reluctant to hire Chinese workers, and Pākehā consumers were reluctant to buy goods from Chinese-owned businesses. So the only way Chinese people could survive was by setting up their own businesses and then working harder and charging a lot less than their Pākehā competitors. And in fact, Lynette Shum says this is actually part of how some Chinese people came to be addicted to opium.
I've heard of it being rolled into tiny balls and taken orally. It meant that you could work in really terrible jobs as a drudge for hours on end, and it would help you cope.
Sort of like taking pain relief so you just don't notice how bad you're hurting.
Yes, it's a combination pain relief and maybe those caffeinated drinks that students seem to be fond of nowadays to keep them going through exam times and keep them focused.
Meanwhile, Pākehā workers saw all this as undercutting their own struggle for better wages and working conditions.
So I think that sits behind these racist attacks that, on the Chinese that really come here as part of the editorial mix that Truth brings, across the Tasman.
In this context, the Truth was eager to seize on any examples of Chinese behaving badly, and then spin it out as if one individual's crimes could define an entire community.
Yeah, I've heard these stories where tender white young women were lured into Chinese laundries in Haining Street, given opium and turned into prostitutes, sex slaves. But it's all rubbish. It's an urban myth.
Lynette thinks these myths served a dual purpose. They demonised the Chinese, and they also served to protect the eugenic purity of New Zealand's white population.
Because New Zealand didn't have anti-miscegenation laws, unlike South Africa or even New Zealand administered Samoa. So there were urban myths like this to tell particularly women how they were to behave among Chinese men. But it's also a process called othering, because we were physically distinctive to Pākehā. You couldn't tell who was Australian, Irish, Scottish or anything like that. So by identifying a visibly different other, then it could unify everybody else.
And I don't want to downplay the seriousness of George Howe's crimes, but we do need to point out that the young women and girls involved were not victims of opium-induced extortion. They just really needed money.
These girls didn't get off scot-free either. They were usually sent to the Salvation Army home. And I recall reading one article where the Salvation Army matron got up and said, "We're going to have her in our care for 6 months, hard labour, for her to see the error of her ways."
As for the men in this story, well, like we said, the two convicted of unlawful carnal knowledge each got a year in prison. George Howe was sentenced to 2 years with hard labour, and that was the maximum possible sentence for brothel keeping.
I don't know whether it was to the extent of breaking rocks, but it was certainly reasonably physical work. But I don't think that he actually served the entire 2-year sentence. I think he would have been out, like today, you serve half your sentence. He would have been out within a year.
And this isn't his last prosecution either. He's prosecuted again a few times, including in 1916.
Yep, he was, I think he'd gotten too well known in his Adelaide Road shop, so he moved and had a smaller grocery store in Kilburnie, and he was charged with keeping a brothel. This time, the prostitutes that he did have in his shop were older. They were in their 30s and 40s.
Do we know what happens to George Howe, or does he just sort of disappear?
There was one last offence that he was charged with keeping a brothel in 1922, but then he kind of disappears off the face of the earth. Whether he left the country or... I certainly couldn't find any information about him after 1922.
Around the same time our determined recidivist, George Howe, vanishes from our story, that real blazing hot anti-Chinese rhetoric starts to fade as well. According to Redma Iska, even the New Zealand Truth started to moderate its tone and actually even reverse it.
there starts to be a bit of a split within the union movement and a lot more sympathy for the Chinese. And actually, I think by the 1920s, Truth's editor, a guy called Hogg, is actually revolutionarily socialist and takes Truth in that direction, unbelievably. More sympathy for the Chinese, and it's really this acknowledgement that they are human beings, that they need to be, treated a lot better. That this sort of actively virulent rhetoric is just completely unacceptable. I really do think it starts to change.
I know this episode has really focused on the worst aspects of Chinese life in early 20th century New Zealand. Racism, poverty, crime. And that's not the whole story of Chinese history in Aotearoa. It's just one part of it.
Actually, we could go that way.
Yeah.
Today, Wellington's Chinatown is long gone. Haining and Frederick Streets are all big apartments and offices. But if you know where to look, there are still fragments.
So just back around that corner is the laundry where my grandfather washed clothes and my grandmother for many, many years afterwards. And so this is now the Suzanne Aubert Compassion Centre and Soup Kitchen. And it's wonderful to me that hospitality is once again being offered to those in the community who not necessarily had the advantages of other people in life. But we're also standing, maybe here, on the site of the very first official Chinese restaurant in Wellington.
Oh, really?
And that was the Nanking restaurant. So fresh noodles made every day on the site and things like duck and roast pork, and you could go around the back and watch the noodles being made, but also with a billy to get it filled so you could go and take it home. Early takeaways. And just down here was another Chinese grocery shop. This one was
These stories are as much of Wellington's history as anything about George Howe or the New Zealand Truth.
Dick and Nancy.
And if you'd like to hear more about that side of our history, I actually have a little bonus for you. I've put together a separate story for another RNZ podcast, Here Now. It's focused on the lives of New Zealand's migrant communities. And in this episode, you can hear Lynette's full tour of Wellington's old Chinatown, or at least as much of it as I could fit in their time slot. That episode of Here Now should be released on September the 16th. You can find it wherever you found this podcast, and I'll probably also post it in this feed just to make sure you don't miss it. That's all from me this episode. Mā te wā. Special thanks to my guests this episode, Lynette Shum, Redma Iska and Scott Bainbridge. If you'd like to go on your own tour through Wellington's Chinese history, I've got a link to our website for last year's tour, which hopefully should get updated with Lynette Shum's next tour dates sometime this summer. For more on New Zealand Truth, check out Redma Iska's book. He also has Wellington, a Biography, which tells a fuller tale of our capital's history. And for more of Scott Bainbridge, well, stay tuned. We'll have more from him very soon. Black Sheep is written and presented by me, William Ray. The sound engineer is William Saunders and our production coordinator is Brianna Uritich. The executive producer is Tim Watkin. We'll be back next week, so make sure to follow Black Sheep wherever you get your podcasts. Ka kite anō.